So welcome to everyone who is joining us. Please continue using the chat to let us know where you're tuning in from. It's great to see we've brought out a lot of our Midwestern friends for this talk today, very apt. But I think we'll go ahead and get started with our webinar today. So thank you for joining us for this Clean Water webinar. My name is Heather Wilson, and I'm the Midwest Save Our Streams coordinator with the Isaac Walton League. Sam, do you want to just make sure that we're recording?
Yep, I'm on.
Thank you. Sorry. So this webinar today will focus on an example of some really great and recent and relevant advocacy that's happening in Minnesota with the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And before we dive into the meat and potatoes of today's webinar, I do just want to remind you that we are recording today's webinar. So if you have to pop out or if you want to revisit this conversation later, you'll be able to do so. You can look for that on our YouTube channel. And secondly, we have our chat function, which many of you have found. Please continue chatting in there and letting us know where you're from and sharing resources and ideas. We also have a Q&A or question and answer area, which I encourage you to use if you have questions that you want to pose to our speakers. We'll get to those at the end of the presentation. And when you use the Q&A, it just makes it that much easier for us to find those questions and make sure that they get answered. So thank you all for joining us again. And before I turn things over to our speakers, Currie and Leigh from the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, I do just want to hog the mic for a moment and kind of make a connection to the Isaac Walton League's work as it relates to the pollution problem that we're going to talk about today, which is nitrate pollution. And if you are familiar with the work of the League, then you probably have heard us talk about Nitrate Watch before. But for those of you who are new to this program, I want to just let you know what it is. So this is our nitrate-focused community science project. So community science means that we are enlisting the help of volunteer scientists from all walks of life, from all over the country, to help us monitor nitrate pollution. And we do this by sending free nitrate test strips to anyone who asks for them as supplies allow, and encouraging them to share their data. And we do this for a couple of reasons. So the first is just to raise awareness about the presence of this pollution problem and its impacts on our health and on our environment. We also are identifying hotspots. We're using the data reported by our volunteers to locate those places in the country where there's a really pronounced issue with this pollution problem in surface water as well as drinking water. And then we don't just want to monitor pollution, we want to help be part of the solution. So we're advocating for solutions and we're connecting with partner organizations and providing resources to our volunteers to help them advocate for those solutions. So if you aren't already a part of the Nitrate Watch community, you can request a kit or learn more about the program at nitratewatch.org. And we'll send you a free kit in the mail. It includes everything you see here. It's got 25 nitrate test strips, so that's 25 data points for you to report. It also includes instructions, which are simple enough that they fit on a postcard. So it's very easy to get involved, very simple. These instructions will help you use your test strips to monitor for the nitrate pollution, but also to report your data, which is a really important next step. So you can request a kit. Once you have your kit, you can use it to monitor nitrate. Like I said, it's very simple, and you can measure surface water, so rivers, lakes, streams, tile, drainage, wetlands. But you can also measure your drinking water, and especially if you're on a well, that could be really interesting and important information, especially if you're already monitoring your well water via some state-funded resource, but you want to supplement that monitoring with your own. This could be a great addition to that routine. So you go out, you monitor your water source, and then lastly, reporting data to the Clean Water Hub database. This resource, the Clean Water Hub, is available to anyone, even if you're not monitoring. It's a great place to just explore what data is being reported, what other folks are seeing and reporting, and what gaps might exist. Maybe if you go to the Clean Water Hub and you zoom into your area and you see there's not a lot of data points, maybe you could help fill in that area on the map. So this is a great resource, not just for data reporting, but for education and exploring. So really quick, again, before I pass the mic, I do just want to show what our data looks like so far this year. So this is our nitrate watch map. This is pulling in all of the nitrate data reported by volunteers across the country. And this is on the Clean Water Hub. It's an interactive map, so you can zoom in, you can click on sites and see more information reported at that site. And you can also filter by date. You can filter by water source type. So if you just want to see, what was reported for rivers last month, you can do that on this map. But as you can see, just at a glance, we're seeing a lot of higher ratings. The green color corresponds to lower nitrate concentrations, and the yellow, orange, and red are cascading up into higher concentrations. And especially in the Midwest, we're seeing that map really lighting up right now. And that kind of makes sense. This graph is new, hot off the press. We'll be sharing some more information about this in the coming week or so. But as the year presses on, we get more fertilizer application and more rain, and this combination leads to more runoff of nitrate into our waterways. And so this graph is showing our volunteer reported data just for surface water. So we've pulled out drinking water, but this is the average nitrate readings reported across the country so far this year. And you can see that they're getting pretty high, especially as we reach into our late spring and summer months. 10 parts per million, or 10 milligrams per liter, is the EPA's standard for drinking water nitrate. There's no national standard for nitrate in surface water, but as you can imagine, nitrate has lots of other impacts on surface waters other than just the fact that it's a harmful drinking water contaminant. We're talking algae blooms, fish kills, really just throwing the ecology a little bit out of whack. But some of these surface water sources are also used to produce drinking water, so it creates that extra strain on our drinking water systems. So thank you to all of the folks out there who maybe have already contributed to this data set this year. Your work does not go unnoticed. Even if you're recording low data points, like say you're not finding high nitrate in your water sources, it's still really valuable data, really valuable information. So please continue monitoring if you are part of the Nitrate Watch community. If you're not, I encourage you to request your kit and join our community. It's really easy, and it's really fun to see your data points appear on the map. One more little plug, we do have a bunch of supplemental resources on our website. If you want to learn more about nitrate pollution, about the Nitrate Watch program, we have some resources to help guide your monitoring, like the Make a Plan worksheet will help you strategize. How will you use all 25 test strips? Where will you monitor, and how often? And what will you do if you find some high readings? And our website did just have a little bit of a facelift, so it might look a little different. If you're used to seeing things in certain places, they might have moved. So the resource library is what I'm directing you to here, iwla.org/resource. And you can find all kinds of helpful resources for education and also advocacy. We have some places where you can quickly take action. You can sign our petition. You can do an action alert. We also have resources to help you craft your own letters to the editor, letters to representatives. And then, of course, our fact sheets are good, not just for increasing your education, but also for using as handouts. If you're working with the public or even with elected officials, these are great resources, and we encourage you to use them widely. But that is going to be the end of my spiel, and a great way to transfer it back over to our speakers for today. They'll be sharing a great example of what their organization has been doing regarding advocacy and nitrate pollution in Southeast Minnesota's groundwater. So with all that said, I'll turn it over to, I believe, Leigh Currie is going to speak first from the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. That was great. I'm so excited to learn about this network. I was not familiar with it, all the data you all are collecting. So I'm excited to dig into that after this. So yes, I'm Leigh Currie. I am the Chief Legal Officer at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. With me today is Griffith. She is our Water Program Director. I'm going to kick us off with kind of an overview of this action that we took a couple of years ago and why we took it and what we were hoping to get out of it. And then Carly's going to pick up from there and talk a little bit about what has happened since then. Just for those of you who are not familiar, MCEA is a state-based nonprofit law firm. We use law and science to protect Minnesota's environment, its natural resources, and the health of its people. So we've been around for 51 years trying to figure out how to protect the things we love. So I need to advance the slide. There we go. So we're here today to talk about an action that we took to address this persistent contamination of public and private water supplies in Minnesota, the contamination with nitrate. As Heather was saying, this puts human health and aquatic life at risk. And nitrate contamination in Minnesota is really concentrated in a few vulnerable groundwater areas. So this is contamination of groundwater or drinking water supplies in particular. And you can see on the map here on the right, the orange sections indicate where tests have come up that are above this 10 milligrams per liter limit under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so you can see that these orange areas are really concentrated in the center of the state and then also in this southeast corner. And then we also pulled out a few counties where we highlighted the percentage of wells that have tested above the safe drinking water limit. So high percentage in these particular counties, and all 5 of these counties that we've highlighted are down in this southeastern portion of our state. And there is a reason why there are certain parts of our state that are more vulnerable to contaminated groundwater. In the southeastern portion, it is because of the specific hydrogeology that we have in that area. So this is a cross section of what it could look like down in that portion of the state. It's called karst geology, and its features include porous or fractured bedrock. So typically like a limestone bedrock that contains a lot of fractures. And this leads to surface features like sinkholes. It leads to streams that could go from a surface stream down through the bedrock into underground source of drinking water, out again to the surface. So it's a very fluid, if you will, relationship between surface and groundwater. And what it also means is that whatever you put on the surface that could filter down into groundwater, that can get into the groundwater very easily and very quickly. So whatever we're using for fertilizer, manure, pesticides, that can all get into the groundwater very easily. And the central part of the state that was also on that first map is not a karst region, but it is a sandy soil region. And so there's similarly this like quick avenue of whatever's happening on the surface to get into drinking water. And then the other factor that creates vulnerability is that these parts of the state also happen to be where there's a heavy concentration of both feedlots, animal feedlots, and corn and soybean row crop agriculture. So the map on the right shows corn and soybean acreage with some high nitrate concentration in certain streams. These are actually, I think, trout streams. The red and orange dot indicate high concentrations. And then the map on the left, the darker one, shows where there are feedlots in this, again, this southeastern vulnerable part of our state. There are different sizes of feedlots. Our permit system in Minnesota that is supposed to protect water quality is focused only on those concentrated animal feeding operations that are above 1,000 animal units, so 1,000 dairy cows essentially, or the equivalent in another kind of animal. And statewide, these largest of the feedlots only account for about 4% of all the animal feedlots, but they contribute about 1/3 of the manure. So they are an outsized contributor when it comes to how much manure they contribute. Overall, this region has about 500,000 dairy cow and cattle, and then about another 260,000 swine units. And then about 60% of the area is in this corn and soybean crop, and an additional 13% is in other types of crops like pasture hay or legumes like alfalfa. So high concentration of agriculture coupled with this vulnerable geology has led to these high concentrations of nitrate contamination. Uh, the other feature, I guess, is that this problem, it has affected both public water supplies and private well owners, but private well owners are particularly at risk. And in rural areas like this area of the state, there are many people who rely on private wells and are not hooked up to a public water system. And because there's no required testing for private wells, there's no required treatment of water that is contaminated. If you do happen to test it, those wells and the people drinking those wells can be particularly at risk for these health impacts from, for example, nitrate contamination. We looked at data of nitrate contamination, and there's about 390,000 people in this region of the state that we were looking at. About 90,000 actually rely on private wells. And about 30 of there were about 32,000 wells sampled in over a certain time period. Statewide, 9% of the wells sampled exceeded the health limit for nitrate. In this karst region of the state, that number was 16%. So quite a few more wells were contaminated in that portion of the state. In some townships, that number was as high as 40%. So almost half of the wells were above the safe drinking water limit for nitrate. As I said, public water supplies are not immune from this. They do often draw from the same aquifers, although they can be deeper, which the deeper the aquifer, the more likely it is to be uncontaminated or with lower contamination levels. But there was one example of a town in Minnesota where the nitrate levels were inching close enough to the federal limit that the town had to dig a new well, and that's a multi-million-dollar investment for these very small rural towns if the public water supplies are threatened. So, Heather touched on this, but again, why does this matter? Why do we care? This is a human health problem as well as affecting fish and other aquatic life. And then ultimately, those costs are borne by society, the economic costs. So there was a safe drinking water limit set in 1962. It was primarily based on or established to protect against what is called blue baby syndrome. There's the official medical name on the screen that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, but it's blue baby syndrome. More recent research, though, has increasingly shown a risk to human health at levels much lower than the federal standard of 10 milligrams per liter. So as low as 3 to 5 milligrams per liter, there's increased risk of adverse birth outcomes, various forms of cancer, etc. The other thing is that where there's nitrate pollution, there are often other contaminants in the water. It's often sort of a canary in the coal mine or a bellwether for other things that might be leaching into your well water. So we were approached, MCEA was approached in kind of late fall or late 2022, in particular by a member of the Minnesota Well Owners Organization, asking us, what can we do about this issue of contamination in southeastern Minnesota? So at MCEA, we are the environmental nonprofit with a lot of lawyers on staff. About half of our staff are lawyers, and that's kind of our lane, if you will. So we did what we do, which is to research what legal options might be available to help these citizens, these residents, protect themselves against this contamination. So, the first thing we kind of looked at is, well, what government agencies in Minnesota have jurisdiction over groundwater quality in Minnesota? So there's several agencies with some sort of tangential role over water quality. There's the Minnesota Department of Health. This agency has jurisdiction over public water supply, so they are our designated state agency under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act to make sure that the public drinking water supplies, which are supplies that serve a certain number of people, that it has to be a certain aggregate number of people that qualify as a public water supply, and the Department of Health ensures that those sources are safe. They also play a role in well construction. So if you're going to put a well in, they have a registry of those wells. And often there's a test done when the well is first established as to the water quality. And then they do continuous health risk assessments of what is a healthy level for people to be drinking. We have a pollution control agency. They are in charge of point source pollution, including concentrated animal feeding operations. And then our Department of Health is really focused on the agricultural inputs like pesticides and fertilizer. So this kind of patchwork quilt of jurisdiction, where none of these agencies specifically have the ability to protect private well owners, led us to look into, well, what has been done in other areas of the country. Let's look at these concentrated animal feeding operations. There's a lot of litigation around that and specific to nitrate contamination. And so that led to the discovery of a case that happened out west where there was a consent decree that the Federal Environmental Protection Agency had entered into with an animal feeding operator in Yakima County in Washington. And the consent order, we learned from digging into this, was based on so a consent order is kind of like a judicial order, but from an agency. So it says, you're causing contamination, you need to stop, essentially. And so digging into that, I said, well, how did they, what was the authority they used to tell this CAFO that they had to stop polluting the private wells around it? And it was authority under the Safe Drinking Water Act, Section 1431. So it was this very specific section that allowed EPA to use emergency authority to protect underground sources of drinking water. So let's dig into what we found out about that section of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So looking into this, we found that there had been requests sent in to the Environmental Protection Agency, 3 at that time that we were doing this research, that had gone in to ask the EPA to use its authority to protect drinking water sources from specifically nitrate pollution. So there was one in 2014 in Wisconsin, 2020 in Oregon, and then 2021 in Washington. EPA had responded to the Oregon and Washington requests. It had not responded to the Wisconsin requests, but in Oregon and Washington, the EPA response had led to some positive changes in the state regulation of nitrate. So we were intrigued to look into whether this could be applicable to our situation in Minnesota. So what exactly does this section say? So under this 1431, EPA has emergency authorities to address contaminated underground sources of drinking water. And this is the key, is that it didn't have to be a public water supply, which is the purview of the Safe Drinking Water Act, as we've talked about, is public water supplies. But in this case, it was an underground source that either served a public water supply or could in the future serve as a source for a public water supply. And that was the key, because essentially any underground aquifer could potentially in the future serve as a source of drinking water. And so even though these aquifers were serving private wells, and that's what we were interested in, the EPA was allowed to invoke this jurisdiction if we showed a couple of things. We needed to show two buckets of information. So we learned about kind of what we had to supply through a guidance memo. So we had to show kind of two buckets of information. The first is that there's a contamination of an underground source of drinking water that poses an imminent and substantial endangerment to human health. So essentially, we had to compile the data that we had in Minnesota showing that there were wells that were testing above the safe drinking water limit, and that, these were people were drinking that water, and this was going to be an imminent and substantial endangerment to their health. The other kind of bucket of information that we had to show was that the state and local authorities were not adequately addressing the problem. So there is this threat. Our state's not doing enough, so we're asking EPA to step in. This 2018 guidance memo was really helpful. The EPA does not issue guidance like this very often. It did so in 1976 when the Safe Drinking Water Act first came into being, 1991, and then this memo in 2018. And this guidance was released in the wake of the Flint, Michigan drinking water crisis. And it states in the memo, one of the purposes of this guidance is to encourage a more widespread use of EPA's Section 1431 authority by more fully explaining situations where this authority may be applied. So they wanted to avoid the disaster that was the Flint, Michigan drinking water crisis by saying, EPA, you can use this in all these types of situations. And one of the situations that was specifically called out in the guidance memo was if there is nitrate contamination in an underground aquifer. And I think it even said, oh yeah, areas with karst geology. So reading that, it was like, ding, ding, ding. Okay, this is definitely something that is applicable to the situation we're facing here in Minnesota. So, once EPA has this information about the contamination and the endangerment, the fact that state and local governments are not effectively addressing the problem, which doesn't have to mean they're not doing anything or they're failing to address it altogether. It just has to mean that what they're doing so far has not been adequate. So then the question is, what can EPA do about it? And the EPA, if it chooses to use this authority, it has pretty broad discretion of how it can do so. So, it can issue administrative, judicial orders, consent orders, as we talked about, and these can go to individual operators, potential responsible parties, or state and local governments. It can order monitoring, which is a pretty gaping absence right now in a lot of the agricultural regulations that we have in Minnesota. There's not a lot of monitoring required to see if they're actually working. And so we were hopeful, that EPA could craft a response that would help us address this issue that we were facing. So one caveat is that there's nothing in this section of the Safe Drinking Water Act that required EPA to even respond at all. So like in the Wisconsin example in 2014, you can compile and submit this information and it can go into the black hole and you never hear anything back. And there's no recourse to appeal that or to challenge that lack of action under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So it was a little bit of a cross our fingers and hope this helps. Maybe it'll help raise awareness if nothing else, but let's go ahead and try this. So with that information, we did submit in 2023 this request to EPA with several other advocacy organizations. You'll see the Isaac Walton League, the Minnesota division was one of the 11 organizations that joined this request. Environmental Working Group and Minnesota Well Owners Organization were pretty instrumental because we ended up relying on data that those groups had collected and compiled to support the request. But as you can see, there were several other state, local, and national groups as well that signed on to this. And then we had a sign-on request separately to support this petition to EPA that we allowed individuals to sign or requested individuals to sign. And so we had over 1,000 individual sign-ons as well. These were the original organizations that signed the initial request, however. So with that, that's kind of the background of why we did what we did and what we did. And I will turn it over to Carly to talk a little bit about what happened next.
Thank you, Leigh. Hi, everyone. I'm Currie Griffith. I'm the Water Program Director at MCEA. And the good news is that the EPA did respond. So we filed the petition in April of 2023. And pretty shortly thereafter, in early November of 2023, the EPA sent a letter to the 3 state agencies that were named in our petition because they have some piece of the jurisdiction over groundwater that Leigh went over earlier. And what their letter said was that based on the available information that had been submitted in the petition, over 9,200 residents, in particular those with private wells, were at risk of contaminated well water above that health limit of 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate. And the EPA went on to say that because of this information, there is an evident need for further actions to safeguard public health. And we were pleased with this response. It was short of a formal administrative order of the type that they do have the authority to issue under Section 1431. But what it did do is it expressed clear expectations about both sort of 2 buckets of action that were needed. The first was immediate public health needs for private well owners. And the second bucket was longer-term source reduction, in particular nutrient management, better approaches to nutrient management in sensitive areas of the state like the karst. So I'm going to dig a little bit more into what those EPA recommendations were. Next slide, please. So the first bucket, as I mentioned, was public health. And the EPA's recommendations here really closely follow the core tenets of the Safe Drinking Water Act. But what it did is it expanded that framework, in this instance, from public water systems, so wells that serve 25 or more people, to private wells. So this included a mandate to the state to identify all private wells in the karst region. And this is really important because the majority of our private wells are tracked in what's called the county well index. So county by county, when a new well is constructed, it's put into the county well index. But there are, in this particular region, there are many what are called pre-code wells that predate the Minnesota Well Code in the 1970s and were not necessarily tracked in county well indexes. And in addition, might not meet the design and construction standards of the Minnesota Well Code and therefore could be at higher risk. It also, included you need to reach out to impacted residents about the potential for contamination and what they can do, because as Leigh said, private well owners are on their own if they want to decide to test or treat their water supply. And that you need to provide free water quality test kits to residents of the karst. It's a pretty big deal, as well as free drinking water for residences where the test shows that nitrate is above the health limit. Next slide, please. And the second piece was a source reduction. And what I mean by that is better nutrient management. How can we better manage the over application of nitrogen from both animal manure and commercial fertilizer in excess of what the crops need? So crops need nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus to grow. That's important, we recognize that. But the issue here was over application, in some cases, significant over application above crop needs in these particularly vulnerable areas, as well as issues like the lack of diversified land cover, like cover crops or perennial crops in a crop rotation. So their recommendations here were a little bit less specific because they don't fall under the Safe Drinking Water Act framework. But they included recommendations that, you need a long-term solution here. You need to reduce the nitrate in these aquifers. You need more protective permits for the very largest feedlots in the state. So those over 1,000 animal units, as Leigh mentioned earlier. And you also need to look at your state rules, your administrative rules that outline manure and fertilizer application in these vulnerable areas. And this is one particular quotation that we thought was helpful. The EPA expects Minnesota to hold sources of nitrate accountable using all available tools to reduce the amount of nitrate they release to groundwater. And then across both of these buckets, public health and source reduction, the EPA said these three state agencies need to do quarterly updates to the EPA, and we reserve the right to intervene with a more formal administrative order or consent order if we don't think these recommendations have been followed. Next slide, please. So the state agency responded. Like I said, the EPA response came out in November of 2023. And in January of 2024, the state agencies responded with a work plan. And it addressed those two buckets, public health and source reduction. Phase 1 and 2 of the plan focus on immediate public health measures education and outreach, a well inventory, testing and private well mitigation. And the third phase, nitrogen source reduction, which was under the jurisdiction of two other agencies, the Pollution Control Agency and the Department of Agriculture, had much more of an unclear timeline than phase 1 and 2, but it had to do with the much longer term work to, for example, consider changes to the general feedlot permit, review the feedlot rules, and in the case of commercial fertilizer, the state agency response was to largely continue to rely on what's mostly a voluntary approach to encourage best practices for commercial fertilizer. Next slide, please. There we go. Okay, so we also had, in addition to the state agency response, January 2024 was also when our legislative session began. It was not a budget year at the legislature. It was what's called a policy year, but we were lucky to have a supplemental budget. So there was supplemental money in the coffers for the state to allocate. And the legislature responded to the needs identified in the petition. The governor's recommendation for the supplemental budget included $4 million for private well mitigation. So that would include treatment, like reverse osmosis system installation. It would include well repair and potentially new wells, especially for some of those pre-code wells that aren't up to design and construction standards. There was also over 13 million, and in the end, about 2.8 million of that recommended 4 million went to private well treatment, in particular in southeastern Minnesota. There was also 13 million allocated in the Clean Water Fund, which is a dedicated sales tax that we're lucky to have here in Minnesota, created by constitutional amendment for clean water projects. And that money went to conservation easement programs, manure management grants, better enforcement of the rules as they do exist. You will all appreciate this as part of because you know the importance of monitoring through the Nitrate Watch program. It also led to the creation of a continuous nitrate sensor network in the state of Minnesota that will have 35 sites across the state with continuous data and public health measures. So in the end, approximately 16 million was allocated in that legislative session for public health and conservation measures. There is some work that remains. We still need a permanent fund source for private well mitigation, but that was a lot of momentum and progress in the session immediately after the EPA response. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that the phase of the agency work plan that had the most unclear timeline and was the most generalized was phase 3 on nitrogen source reduction. And after the change in the federal administration, this past in the 2024 election, we had, I think, the reasonable expectation that the EPA would be less of a federal watchdog in this process. And so MCEA and two other petitioner organizations, Minnesota Trout Unlimited and Minnesota Well Owners Organization, decided to file a lawsuit under the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act that challenged the adequacy of those state rules for animal manure and commercial fertilizer, and their ability in particular to protect the most vulnerable aquifers in the state. The complaint outlined specific inadequacies that our organizations think do have reasonable and feasible solutions. We recognize the importance of agriculture to our state economy. We recognize that the challenges in the Farm Bill, for example, but we outlined what we thought were problems with reasonable and feasible solutions, like application rate restrictions in the most vulnerable parts of the state, and an expanded mitigation response that expands beyond public water system wellhead protection areas to include vulnerable townships and private well owners whose water supply is at risk. There's a limited remedy that is available under this section of the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act. Basically, what we would get is that a remand to the agencies to consider the adequacy of their rules and potentially open a rulemaking. And ultimately, any changes to either of these rules would be a broad public comment process, and the outcome would not be dictated by MCEA or by the other plaintiffs in the lawsuit. However, we see the lawsuit as a legal backstop to hopefully ensure the meaningful and timely review of these state rules with broad public participation. Next slide, please. And the good news is that we have started to see some movement on that phase 3 work for long-term source reduction. In January 2025, the general feedlot permit went through a revision. It is revised every 5 years. And this particular revision applied both to state and federal permits that cover the largest feedlots in the state, which is approximately 1,200 out of the 18,000 feedlots in the state. And it included what we thought were common sense and incremental measures to better protect vulnerable aquifers. And that changed. The agency's plan for this permit revision changed after the EPA's response to our petition to include these additional measures to protect vulnerable regions of the state. That includes things like expanded cover crop requirements or diversified crop rotation, incentives for fall application of manure when the soil is bare otherwise, and no liquid application of manure to frozen or snow-covered ground in the winter. There is also currently a public comment period open here in the state of Minnesota through July 22nd for the agency, the Pollution Control Agency in this instance, to consider potential revisions to the state feedlot rules. And I want to emphasize that this is a big deal. The last major amendment of the state feedlot rules was 25 years ago in 2000. And the fact that the state has now opened this comment period to consider revisions is a major opportunity for organizations like MCEA, like the Isaac Walton League or other organizations that may be represented here today to make their voice heard and put in their thoughts. And there is potential changes to, this is just the very start of that process. Potential changes to the feedlot rules itself would be a 3 to 5 year process. But this is our moment to get our initial thoughts heard and on the record. And there is a link in the chat to a sign-on comment that MCEA has put together. We also plan to hold a virtual comment party, which is a first for us, on June 26th, to get people together to talk about the administrative public comment process and why it matters, and have time for people to write their own comments. And I also want to say, because I saw we had a lot of attendees here from Iowa, that there will be a forum in southeastern Minnesota in Winona County on June 24th. and Chris Jones will be one of the speakers at that event. Next slide, please. So with that, we want to open space for questions and discussion, but to wrap up our presentation, I just wanted to say that this EPA petition was another step in a long road that has involved many years of work by many different organizations on the entrenched issue of nitrate groundwater contamination. But what it has provided is useful momentum to, number one, get more state agency coordination across those silos and jurisdiction that Leigh opened with. And number two, move the state forward on both immediate public health measures and long-term source reduction goals. And at the end of the day, the EPA petition really centered on that public health message that everyone deserves safe water at the tap, whether they are a private well owner or on a public water system. And the work is just, there's many more years of work to come on this. So we're happy to be a part of that, that work.
So Heather, there's a couple questions in the chat that I thought maybe we could
Yeah. I'll go ahead and kick us off with the first one. But I guess first, thank you so much, both Leigh and Carly, for that great presentation. And obviously, thank you for the work that you're doing in Minnesota that is affecting so many people. As mentioned, there are some questions in our Q&A that we are excited to get to. Keep dropping those in there, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. So the first one that I see is actually a question that addresses Isaac Walton, so I can take that one. It's asking, is the IWLA advocating for a lower standard than 10 parts per million? That's a lower drinking water standard for nitrate. And as mentioned, health effects have been reported at less than 10 parts per million. So the good news is that this process has technically already started. The process to evaluate the drinking water standard begins with this thing called an IRIS assessment, which is integrated risk information system. Basically, it's the EPA is required to evaluate scientific research, including more recent discoveries, and that would be the first step towards evaluating a new drinking water standard. And we absolutely support that process. As we've all discussed, there is a lot of more recent research than what was used to create that original 10 parts per million standard, which was only really created to address one of the many health conditions that are affected by nitrate pollution. And we actually, our national president, Jody Lobbs, and our Iowa division president, Dale Braun, they submitted a op-ed that was published in a few Iowa papers recently that was voicing support for this process. We definitely are keeping an eye on the IRIS assessment and hoping that it is seen through to its fruition and that it takes into consideration all the recent science that we're all aware of. That, so we're keeping an eye on that process, and I encourage you all to do the same. So let's keep moving down the line. There was a question that came in relatively early that was in reference to the MPCA's outreach to, the MCEA's outreach to the MPCA about feedlots. So what was your goal in reaching out to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency about feedlots?
Yeah, I can take that one. So our goal was, we had a lot of conversations with the MPCA before we chose to file the petition. And, we wanted to know about their planned revisions to the general feedlot permit for the largest feedlots, which we did not think were sufficient at the time that we first had those discussions with them. So our goal with the petition, in particular, the outreach to the MPCA through the petition, was to, number one, get stronger revisions to that general feedlot permit for CAFOs, the largest feedlots in the state, which we did accomplish in that January 2025 revision. And our second goal was to open up a revision of the feedlot rules, which, as I said earlier, have not been significantly revised in 25 years. As we all know, there have been very significant changes to animal agriculture and to environmental awareness of some of the impacts in the past 25 years. And we wanted that new information to be reflected in the rules.
And just to be clear, because I think this can be really confusing, the permit, as Carly said, applies to these largest of the large animal feeding operations. The rules apply to all animal feeding operations. So there's an opportunity there. We did the permit revisions. That happens every 5 years. The rules themselves are broader than the permit. They feed into what the permit has to include, but they apply to all feeding operations and can have a lot more impact than just the permits. So it's a big opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. Okay, moving along our list of questions. Remember, you're welcome to keep contributing questions. The next question says, has there been any change in the EPA oversight in the new Trump administration? I think you mentioned a little bit of the expectation of this, but I wonder if there's actually been indications that it has really changed.
Yeah, we haven't actually had contact in 2025 with the current EPA. We were working with the other states that have submitted similar requests to EPA. And so leading up to the change in administration, we actually did have some meetings with high-level EPA administrators to ask them a couple, well, so to back up, after Minnesota submitted its request to EPA, there was another request that came in Iowa. So the karst region in Minnesota actually, isn't confined to state lines. It's not political, and it goes down into that northeastern part of Iowa as well. And so they have very similar problems. So there was another request sent in 2024. And so we were working as a broad coalition trying to get EPA, one, respond to Iowa because they have the same problem and they weren't responding. And then two, this deserves a really coordinated national response because it is sort of this national crisis at this point. And so we were having good conversations with EPA up through like even, I think it was October, November of 2024. And we have not had another one since then. So I do think there has been a change, and they understandably, because I think with a lot of the layoffs, they're really short-staffed right now as well.
Definitely. Okay, this next question is a two-parter, so I'm going to start with just the first half. It says, how do well nitrate levels correlate with water softener use and well depth?
I'm going to let you do that one, Carly.
Yeah, I don't know about water softener use, so I'd be interested to hear, Dan, if what impacts you've seen based on water softener use. But in terms of well depth, the state has begun to put together this online dashboard where they will put test results as they come in. The state has started to provide free water quality tests to private well owners in Southeast Minnesota. So far, the number above the nitrate limit of 10 milligrams per liter has been about 12% from those tests that they've sent out. And they don't, unfortunately, track depth with that information, but we do know much more broadly from groundwater studies in the karst region that the most elevated levels of nitrate are in the surficial aquifers right below the water table, and that the deeper you go, especially once you cross aquitard, so often clay confined layers that protect the deeper bedrock aquifers, you'll have lower nitrate levels. However, that can sometimes be disrupted. That general pattern can sometimes be disrupted in the karst because you have these very deeply incised valleys where you can have groundwater springs that are much more closely connected to activity at the land surface. So general trend, the surficial aquifers have the most elevated levels of nitrate. And another general trend is that deeper aquifers that more often provide water to public water systems continue to slowly rise in nitrate level as water from those surficial aquifers slowly moves down into deeper aquifers.
Wow, that's fascinating. There's so much going on underground.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, the next part of that question is, does the EPA's response extend to the neighboring states like Iowa and Wisconsin that might be affecting Minnesota's groundwater quality as well?
Yeah, so I can take that one. The EPA is set up by region. So we in Minnesota are Region 5, Iowa, I think is region, I can't remember if it's 7 or 8. Do you
I think
remember?
it's
I think 7.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so there are the jurisdictional lines, and then the other piece of it is that, like in our case, EPA's response was directed to our state agencies. And so our Minnesota state agencies can't really extend that response to neighboring states, even though we all know that the contamination issues can cross state lines. So unfortunately, the solutions are generally more political than scientific. And so we're constrained usually to state lines for the solutions.
And I'll just add, we have been part of that national coalition that Leigh mentioned of other state petitioners to try to get the EPA Region 7 to respond to Iowa's petition that was filed after ours, but that has not yet happened.
And was the guidance given in Minnesota confined to just the southeast portion of the state too, or was that accepted more broadly?
It was prioritized for southeastern Minnesota. We do have these other vulnerable groundwater areas, like Leigh mentioned, the sandy soils in the central sands region of the state. So we have interpreted it to try to push for broader change in those vulnerable groundwater areas, the karst and central sands in particular.
It's all connected, as we know. Okay, we've got one more question, and if there's any others thinking about submitting one, you still have some time, but we'll tackle this last one now. How would you recommend environmental groups interact with the EPA for enforcement of environmental standards, given the changes imposed on the EPA under this new administration?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start and then I'll kick it to you, Carly. So, I think, tend to have tunnel vision sometimes as an environmental attorney, but I do see legal avenues as one way environmental groups can continue to be pushing EPA for enforcement action. So, there are a lot of environmental statutes that have what's called a citizen suit provision where groups can take what the EPA rule or standard is, and if it's not being enforced by EPA, go ahead and sue to have that standard enforced themselves. And so that is one option. Obviously, not every environmental group has lawyers on staff like MCEA, but there are groups like MCEA scattered around the country. Some are regional, some are state-based. In Iowa, there's the Iowa Environmental Council. There's a group called the Environmental Law and Policy Center that's a regional Midwest legal nonprofit. So that's what comes to mind for me. But, Carly is usually better at thinking more broadly. So I don't know if you have other thoughts, Carly.
I think that we've seen more opportunities at the state level at this time because of the change in the EPA and the federal administration's priorities, which is part of why we are excited and have invested a lot of resources in this potential feedlot rule comment period. That is a state process, that is a state rule. And we also have been encouraged by the response at the state legislature and some of the investments that have been made. So I think that we are a state-focused organization. We usually do more work at the state level already, but I do see this as a time where there's good opportunities to push your states because we're not going to see a lot of progress on these issues at the federal level. So I see it as a good opportunity for state advocacy.
Well, that is a great kind of note to end it on, I think, that note of action, even in the face of an obstacle, there's still things we can be doing. For anyone who's tuning in from Minnesota, make sure you grab those links from the comment for the MCEA's feedlot rule comment and their comment writing party. And remember, we will be sharing a recording of this webinar when it's available. But once again, I just want to thank our speakers today from the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. Thank you so much, Leigh and Carly. And thank you to everyone who participated in this discussion. We really appreciate your questions. All right.
Thank you for having us. This was great. Thanks, Heather.
Of course.
Thank you so much.
All right. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.